Today's topic, compare and contrast. What is the delegation of another hurting state doing to pull out of its economic slump? We'll find out what federal efforts my Michigan guest says have worked and not worked in his state. And my guest today is Michigan U.S. Congressman Thaddeus McCotter. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We're doing something on Eye on Washington today we've never done in the history of our program, but that we believe will be beneficial to you and our audience. Today on Eye on Washington, we'll talk with a representative from another state that's badly hurting in this slumped economy, and we'll learn which federal efforts have worked there and which have not. My guest, Congressman McCotter, represents Livonia. It's a suburb of a city you might have read about since the recession hit, Detroit, Michigan. News reports have for months had Nevada and Michigan jockeying for that unenviable top slot for unemployment, foreclosures, and overall economic pain. Let's start with jobs. In March of this year, Nevada's unemployment rate was down 0.3%, dropping from 13.2% from February's 13.6% rate. Meanwhile, in my guest state, about 500,000 Michiganders were out of work in March, and the unemployment figure was at 10.3%. That's a significant improvement from, say, November 2009, when ABC News reported Michigan led the nation in joblessness at 15.1%. Last year, 2010, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Nevada was number one for unemployment at 14.9%, a big jump from its 2009 rate of 12.5%. Michigan held second place last year at 12.5%. Now Michigan's greatly improved in the last year and a half. About 10.3% remains worse than the overall percentage rate of folks out of work nationally, which was 0.2% in March. Congressman, sorry about all those stats, but I did want to kick us off with some explanation. First, Nevada's 13.2% figure. Employers added 7,600 seasonally adjusted new jobs in March. It's the largest month increase since September '05. It's a bit of good news if we're to believe that people are actually getting jobs and not, or the figure doesn't just represent people dropping out of the market. But correct me if I'm wrong, Michigan seems to be recovering a bit more quickly than Nevada.
Well, we're a manufacturing state in Michigan. We get sicker quicker, we get better later. The reason that we're seeing employment rise now is because there was a large backlog, an aging car fleet. As the recession hit, people started putting off the car purchases. And now they're starting to make those purchases at the present time, so we're seeing GM announce bringing people back to work as opposed to what we saw for so many years. Ford, Chrysler as well. But the reality remains is that that's a bottleneck in the purchasing. So what will happen is we have to continue to make sure that the auto industry is able to continue to meet demand, continue to compete globally so that that can remain a steady sale of cars as opposed to a once-in-a-lifetime boom and then we go back to the bus.
And similarly, other than manufacturing, similar to Nevada, Michigan saw a big hit on construction jobs, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Our skilled trades actually would, when the recession hit in Michigan, the construction would continue at the time in Las Vegas and Nevada. And so many of our people would go there to find work. Many of them would leave their families back home, try to find steady work, and either bring them out, or in some cases they wouldn't be able to sell their homes, and they would still have to bring the families out. Michigan, in some ways, is still searching for that diversification of our economy that we have yet to find, with the auto industry obviously remaining the predominant industry within our state. The foreclosure crisis was very painful for us. It's still not resolved in Michigan as opposed to anywhere else in the country. The failed Wall Street bailout did not solve that problem. And so we continue to look for diversification. What our governor is doing to, as he says, reinvent Michigan is he recognizes the times in which we live. He recognizes that the government industrial welfare state model is no longer viable. And then what we have to do is make it a more accountable, transparent, and horizontal citizen-driven government to match what is now a consumer-driven economy. And if we do not do that and create an entrepreneurial environment, not only will we continue to lack diversification in our economy and remain subject to cyclical recessions, we will continue to lose our most precious resource, which is our children, which when they graduate from college continue to leave Michigan for other states to find jobs.
You know, speaking of that entrepreneurial effort you spoke about, we're going to get into what has worked and not worked in Nevada and Michigan regarding helping small business. I do want to get to that. I want to say quickly, as I told you before we began today, that the program generally looks at how federal efforts affect Nevada. But since the two states have really been in the same world of hurt since the recession began, what efforts, I want to ask you, have you made on the federal level to help the jobless situation in Michigan, and how can you compare that to what may or may not work in Nevada, since they're so similar?
Well, I think we have to start looking at the macro level. One of the problems that we have is the federal government continues to print money, the federal government continues to spend money. As a Republican, I believe that our prosperity comes from the private sector, not the public sector. One of the things that we're starting to see is the breakdown of the federal stimulus, which was really a government bubble to replace the housing bubble that lapsed. And now that it's starting to go, what it's seeing is putting pressure on states across the board. What we have to do at the federal level is get back to fiscal integrity. We have to make sure that the federal government doesn't spend more than it brings in, that we show some stewardship of the public's money so that we increase the confidence in markets, we increase the confidence of entrepreneurs to go make those startups, knowing that the federal government isn't going to come in and try to tax them for the overspending in Washington. So because Republicans only control the House, thanks to the sovereign people entrusting us with it, it remains our job to try to continue to put forward the bread and butter of prosperity in America, is reductions in taxation, regulation, and litigation. Because as you know, at the federal level, so many people who think of expanding, so many people who think of hiring new people, or so many people who become disenchanted with the prospects of ever finding work or employment that suits their talent level, have been waiting for the federal government to stop making it harder for those things to happen.
As we're ending this segment, help our audience to understand, I know you certainly know this, what does the term seasonally adjusted mean? You know, we read these employment figures every month.
Well, in a tourist industry like Michigan, we will have seasonally adjusted, where you will have in the summertime especially.
As well.
Yes, you're kind of year-round.
Right.
But we have a winter, we have fewer people, so seasonally they adjust it per season to see who's working where and what industries. But the key thing to remember about the unemployment rate that is so upsetting to people is when you hear the official unemployment rate, that does not include people who have been so frustrated that they gave up looking for work, or people who are underemployed. So theoretically, if you had an economy where no one was looking for work anymore, you would have a 0% unemployment rate. That's how perverse the numbers are out of Washington. The real measure of whether or not we're in a recession is what's happening in your community, what's happening in your household. And I can tell you from Michigan, we remain in a recession.
Okay, we're going to talk more about unemployment, double-dip unemployment, when Eye on Washington returns right after this. And welcome back to Eye on Washington, our discussion of recessionary comparisons between Nevada and Michigan, two states that have shared the top two slots for worst off since the recession hit. We've been visiting with a very special guest today, again, U.S. Congressman Thaddeus McCotter. Well, let's spend this segment looking at housing. Nevada had the highest foreclosure rate in the nation for the fourth consecutive year in 2010. 2011 thus far isn't looking much rosier for the state's housing market. According to Reality Track, which follows real estate trends, in March, 1 in every 88 housing units received a foreclosure filing. Michigan, number 7 for foreclosures, with 1 in every 311 homes facing or receiving a filing. But consider Michigan's much larger population to explain the first and 7th place ranking. In Michigan in March, 93,446 homes were in foreclosure. Average foreclosure sales price, $73,965. Nevada, 67,700 homes in foreclosure. Average sales price a bit higher, $131,430. And while February was dismal for those trying to sell, March was better. The Nevada foreclosure sales were up more than 109% in March from the previous month. Again, what's being done on the Hill to help? What can Nevada learn, if anything, from efforts by the the Michigan delegation? Some efforts by the Nevada delegation, again, some individually, some as a group, include legislation to help hardest hit states, help hardest hit neighborhoods, require mortgage services to provide a notice of eligibility for federal mortgage assistance, protect homeowners from scams, provide foreclosure avoidance counseling, provide mortgage modification, dozens more efforts related to shoring up the state's deteriorated housing market. Now, Congressman, Nevada's top for foreclosures, but according to the March report in the Christian Science Monitor, Michigan is much worse off for supply of distressed properties, meaning it would the months it would take to sell them. So it's certainly no picnic there.
No, we were again hard pressed, even though Ford did not go through the bridge loan process as GM and Chrysler did. There was massive restructuring within the auto industry even prior to the bridge loan from the federal government and the subsequent bankruptcy process. So what you had were a whole lot of people losing their jobs. You've also situations we touched upon where the young people are leaving Michigan to find jobs because of the absence of diversification in our economy. So when you think about it, when you're losing your young, brightest people who should be staying in an entrepreneurial environment to build their pursuit of the American dream and buying houses in the neighborhoods they grew up in, what you found instead was the single dominant industry was being radically restructured, job losses there, the kids were leaving, and there was no other entity, no other entrepreneurial endeavor that would bring people into the state. So for Michigan, it was a question, it was a double whammy. What you had were people who could not sell their homes if they wanted to. The kids who might someday or could potentially buy the starter homes were leaving, and you had no one coming in to fill that void. And so it continues to be a problem. So when we talk about what we can do at the federal level, while the Republicans and Democrats in our delegation have been very supportive of the auto industry, what we also have to recognize is that even if you fix everything at the federal level, individual states, which remain the laboratories of democracy, have to create an entrepreneurial environment, or people will go to one of the other 49.
Speaking of individual states, I want to talk about a program I've talked about several times on this show, and I know that your delegation and the Nevada delegation, of course, are very familiar with, and that's the hardest hit fund that was set aside for the 5 states hardest hit by the double horror of a lost home and lost job. How's it going in Michigan? Is it a good program? Is it doing enough? Is it doing anything? What are your constituents saying about it?
We don't think that it's done enough. We don't think that it's necessarily justifying the expense. We believe that it was well-intentioned. Governor Snyder is looking at it to see whether or not it to make it work. But it is an example, again, where the best way that we can fix the housing crisis in this country is to clean up the banks and to make sure that there's a growing economy so that people can have the jobs that allow them to keep their homes, and that the Wall Street banks aren't simply going to continue to be rewarded for these excessive loans that went out to many people who could not afford them.
Finally, you know, as a congressman from a high foreclosure state, there's 2 Michiganders you're dealing with, one in foreclosure, one facing foreclosure. How do you deal with both?
We deal with them at a humane, compassionate level. A lot of them are friends, a lot of them are neighbors. We see this throughout our communities.
As far as policy?
As policy is, you don't want to make it worse by trying to have the federal government come in, overspend money we don't already have, continue to drive the economy down and give them no hope that they'll ever have a job again because the economy has gone into stagflation.
Okay. We're going to be right back with our final moments on today's Eye on Washington.